Hi, I'm Patricia Allingham Carlson, and this is my watercolor video of Symphony of Light. I'm a big fan of sunsets, and I really enjoy gazing at different colors and the way they play across the sky as the sun goes down. So when I saw this photograph by photographer Gregory Kear, I was transfixed. I asked him for permission to use it as an inspiration for a painting, and it was granted. So here it is, step by step. I hope you enjoy it. Give it a thumbs up, and now let's paint. To begin, I just barely sketched a horizon line. This is where the water and the sky meet, and then there are several islands breaking up the space along the two shorelines. I applied water all over the skyline, and I tried to keep my strokes and the disbursement of the water nice and even. Now, when you're working wet on wet like this, you have to keep in mind that things will dry. I began with my light, bright color of cadmium yellow. And next I mixed up some cadmium red and some vermilion orange. I painted it right next to the yellow to encourage the colors to spread together. And then looking at the image and the photograph, I placed the colors all around where they were. Now you can see I'm working on the yellow sun color, taking out a little bit more around the edge with a damp brush. I can apply more yellow later, but I did not want it to run all into the red. So that is why I'm taking a little bit off right now. Cobalt blue came on next, and then some ultramarine blue as I went higher up into the sky. These clouds are being created with indigo, and you can see how beautifully they disperse and flow in the wet on wet approach. Now the complicated part, the most complicated of this whole painting, was a big billowy mess of clouds on the left. And they were in salmon and oranges with some darker storm clouds to the left. So that's why that big left space is left. And I'm beginning them now. I didn't want them all to run into the blue because I wanted the colors to stay fresh, and that's why I left the whites there. I'm coming in with some permanent rose, more cadmium yellow, and then my indigo. And I'm so hoping that the colors will blend without running together. Now you can see I'm adding a little bit of purple. I don't know if you can tell how much fun I'm having by this challenge, but I really am. I wanted the edges to be a little lighter, so I'm taking some color off. Now you can see I'm adding it back on, but leaving a little bit of a white edge on the far edge of the cloud. And I was thinking that was exactly what I wanted to do. Meanwhile, My dark clouds in the sky have done some fading, so I'm reinforcing them with another layer. The paint is slightly dry at this point. I'm going back and reinforcing my yellows, which have faded a bit on the wet paper. And bringing some blues into the clouds. The next day, you could see that the painting has done some fading. Not fading so much as the wet paper dispersing the colors. So I'm going back for a third time to reinforce the colors. At this point, the paper is not wet. So anywhere I put color down, I have to blend it out with a damp brush at the edges. Here I've added a bit more cadmium yellow to that tremendous sunset coloring. And now I'm adding some more red. This seems to be taking a lot of fussing and adjusting of colors. But I was challenged to really try to get it right and to make it look blended and natural, like a real sunset sky. So the challenge and the colors were a lot of fun, as I said. Next, I get out my masking fluid because I want to mask in some horizontal lines in the water. This is for the reflections and the ripples. I also like to leave some whites or some areas of light along the edges of the shores. This is a reflected light, and you'll see this quite often when you have a painting of a lake or a stream, where along the shoreline you have some light showing or sparkling, even in a darker picture. I'm using an ink pen to get fine lines. The finest lines in the water will be back toward the edge or toward the horizon. As I move forward in the paper space, I'm starting to use the end of the ink pen to make wider lines, because perspective-wise they would be wider. My thought was I want to paint freely without worrying about keeping certain light areas. If I put down too much light masking, I could always paint over it later. Better to have too much than not enough. While the masking dries, I move back to the sky. I'm taking a little bit of color off where I want some transparency showing. And then when dry, I'm starting to bring the reflected colors of the sky into the water. I'm starting out pale, and I will be making these darker once I figure out exactly where they all need to go. The water and the sky do not have to identically meet up in a surface that's got a little bit of turbulence. If it's a very, very clear and no wind type of situation, you're going to have a mirror image. But this is not that situation. The water and the flow of the waves drags colors around, obscures some, and makes others bright, others dull. The dark clouds going through the sky break up the color as well. And this is not a mirror reflection. I'm also painting around banks and land masses, so I have to try to keep that in mind because they're blocking out part of the sky. One of my primary concerns here, though, is painting the water going across and not getting diagonal on it because it is horizontal in these wave patterns that I'm looking at anyway. After I get the bright colors on and the light colors on, I'll be coming back in with the darker colors later. Now my brightest reds are coming in, and they had some odd reflection patterns that I decided to keep from my photographic reference. Red is an exciting color, so I'm using a lot of it in this painting because this sunset is very exciting. With the brights and the lights down, now I'm coming in with some darks. Here I've mixed Payne's Gray with indigo. Along the shoreline, it is quite dark, and the deepest reflections will go on later. On the left shoreline, there was some breaks in the trees and light came shining through. So I'm trying to make sure I keep that, maintain that. The right shoreline was further back and was much more solid. I just used the pencil to make sure I got a straight line where I wanted it and where it was reflecting downward from what was in the sky. I didn't want to go sideways on it. So that was a good tool for me. You might find it helpful too. You can use a ruler or a pencil or even a paintbrush, whatever's handy, just to make sure you go straight down from what you want to reflect in your water. I'm continuing to use the darks to plan where all of the action is in the water. And this takes quite some time too. After I get one layer down, I'm going back and frequently adding a second layer or a second glaze of color. This painting took many hours of work. Once I had the water to my satisfaction, I began working on the far right shore. Here I've mixed some purple into my indigo and Payne's gray mix. And you could see the purple showing through the paint. This was going to take a lot of glazing color. I did not want to use black because I find black to be a little harsh sometimes in watercolor. If black works for you, go for it. But very concentrated color is being used here, and I will be applying several glazes of color. There will be some trees showing on the left side shore, but the right side shore only has a very small amount of trees. Now once my shore lines are marked out, I am taking off all of that masking. You're going to see a big change because I put down a lot of masking. And now it looks like there's not enough color in the water. But I really do learn with this kind of challenging painting. And I like to learn and figure out what works and what needs more work and what I can change next time. Masking removed, I began working on the farthest away water. There were some very definite color lines in that water. And a very distant shoreline. And then I decided I should get the land masses filled in so I could see what I'm working with for my water more accurately. So that's what I went to next. Along the top of the right shoreline, I've made little tiny spiky bumps to indicate some trees. Moving back to the water, I begin to re-add some of the darkest colors that are streaking across. I'm being careful to paint around many of the white masking lines so that I can keep the sparkle and the color in the water and not just make it all dark. What you're seeing me do now is taking off a little color where I put too much on, and it wasn't working. So I'm painting it over with a damp paintbrush and then blotting color off with a paper towel. If you have a super complicated and challenging painting, I strongly recommend using a very good paper to paint it. This is Arches paper, and you really can take a lot of color off. And the paper will take a bit of a beating, whereas cheaper papers frequently do not stand up to this kind of scrubbing activity like the Arches will. but there are many good papers. What's your favorite? Love to hear about it in the comments. Back to the shorelines. I am making the next shoreline a little closer to us. For the time being, I'm leaving it a little lighter on the edge just to see if that looks right or not. And then I'm going in and making some of those little spiky tree tops along the edge. The closer it gets to the viewer, the more detail could be in the shore. And you can see where I'm breaking the bottom edge as well, with some little rocks and some inlets. And then darkening the color with another layer of indigo, Payne's gray, and purple. Onto the left shoreline. In the photograph that I'm viewing, this is where the trees began to show at the tops of these islands in the silhouettes against the sky. But first I have to get the colors in. In the places where the tree lines were broken, a little bit of sky showing through, and that's what I just painted in. And the next thing I'll do is get a very thin brush and begin to paint in some tiny little trees and branches. You could see that they're growing right up into the sky that I've already painted and creating nice silhouettes against the colors. With the first layer of the shoreline color blocked in, I begin to develop the water again, based on how the shoreline is reflecting into it. Some of the dark clouds that streak across the sky are being picked up in the water. Some are not. The area closest to the horizon line was the lightest reflective colors, and that's why I'm treating it that way. There were some few pale reds and some few pale blues. So I'm slowly building that up. adding another glaze of color to the shoreline and some more trees growing up into the sky. At this point, I'm thinking I'm done, and I sign my name. But looking at it a little later that day, I feel that the shorelines don't seem accurate or right. I want to lower the height on the right side. So I begin to work into that effect, taking color off from the tops of those shoreline edges. So I'm using a damp brush and I'm removing color, hopefully. I've also removed a little color at the bottom because I want the bottom to be a little higher. The left side, I decided, also needed to be higher. So I'm adjusting that as well. I was a little discouraged because I thought it was just about done, and then I realized it didn't look right to me. And since I'd spent so very much time working on the sky and this water, I wanted it to look right. So it was back to work again, and I'm doing some subtle adjustments on the left side. I will need to work some more on the trees at the top because I've made this whole bank much higher. And then I'll need to go back to the sky and fill in the colors where I removed color. What I'm doing now is removing color along the shorelines where the island meets the water. Because of that reflective light I talked about earlier at the edge of the shorelines. And then I begin to fill the reflection back in on the right side, and to work on the sky and fill in the colors that I took off. They won't be as clean as if I was working on fresh white paper, but I can adjust for that and compensate by putting in cloud colors. I'm using some strong brights, at least partially. With the adjustments I've made on the shorelines, it feels more natural looking to me. I am darkening the shoreline and the distant land yet another time, and this time I think they will be dark enough. And here I'm looking at my angle for my shoreline to make sure it's right. I'm using a piece of black construction paper. And then making adjustments. I was just looking at my finest brushes so that I could see which one might be best for painting these tiny little trees that break the skyline. Back to the water, I am softening the edges of some of the lines that I've painted in. I'm doing that with a damp brush and blotting. Also removing a bit of color where I wanted to show some more whites. Now we're down to the final tweaks, and I'll be more satisfied to call this completed. A friend suggested I add a little bit more color to these wispy clouds on the right side, and I thought it was a good suggestion, so I did it. I'm using my comparison side-by-side cover-up to see if anything needs more tweaking, and that gives me an objective point of view. A lot of tweaking. I hope you enjoyed watching my very highly tweaked Symphony of Light painting being painted. I hope you'll give it a thumbs up. That will help me out. And if you subscribe and ring the bell, you won't miss any future videos. There's some links below you can check out too, if you'd like. Products I use, my Facebook art page, a blog that I write about art and life, and some products that I create myself. I hope you got some value out of my video, and I'll see you next painting.